Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us for our first district coordinator webinar of the summer. As always, I'm Erin Suddeth, and I'm the branch manager for the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch at KDE. I know we have a couple of new coordinators who've already joined, so they may be on here. Let's see. I've already asked you all to make sure that your microphones are muted and that your cameras are turned off, so thank you all for doing that. We will have time for questions at the end, as we always do. So you can come off mute at that time. You can use the raise hand feature if you're joining us through Teams, or if you're joining through the media portal, if you want to just send an email to erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov, you can do that. And we do record and post all of these on the web page afterwards, so it'll probably be up later today or maybe tomorrow. Quick recap from our May webinar. If you weren't able to join us, we had some different announcements and reminders, as well as our recurring reminders about spending down your funds and looking at the that month's Title I newsletter. We had our friends from PCG join us to talk about the next opt-in period for Title I Next, but our main focus was on the written transportation agreement for children in foster care, and that is a document that has to be developed jointly with the local child welfare agency. It's more than just your policy about transportation, and as I mentioned last month, that is a very common finding that we see in both desk monitoring and consolidated monitoring visits. So if you did not watch that recording, be sure to go back and do that. Today, we've got, again, our usual announcements and reminders. And our main focus is going to be on reminders and tips for completing the FY 2025 GMAP application. And before anybody puts it in the chat, no, I don't have a date on when that's opening yet, but we want to go ahead and be ready for when it does open. All right, our announcements. Just want to remind everybody to make sure that you're wrapping up your initial consultation and planning for equitable services for any private and or home schools who have indicated that they want to participate and receive services for next year. So that involves completing that equitable services packet or agreement, communicating with the private and home schools about kind of when they can anticipate a start date for those services. Services are supposed to start on or around the same time as they do for the public schools, so pretty close to the beginning of the school year. Make sure that you set up meetings with your participating private and home schools for ongoing consultation. Consultation is not a one and done thing. It continues throughout the year. And then if you are going to be hiring any staff to provide services, make sure that you're taking care of that, onboarding them, things like that. And then for our districts who have opted in to the Title I Next program, make sure that you're in communication with your district and school staff that they're going to need to begin collecting documentation for the 24-25 school year and getting that uploaded into Title I Next. Quick look at our timeline for making sure that you're on track to meet the 85% obligation requirement. So at least 85% of your 310K funds needs to be obligated, meaning spent or encumbered, by September 30th of this year. Again, remember these percentages that you see on the screen, these aren't required by ESSA. This is just kind of an estimate to help keep you on track. So by the end of June, we should be looking at about 68% having been obligated. So if you are significantly below that point, make sure that you're reaching out to your finance officer and verifying that you're on track to meet that requirement, that you're not going to need a carryover waiver. For example, we know that salaries can't be encumbered. So those of you who are paying for a lot of staff, you may be below 68% at that time. But if you get with your finance officer and kind of look at that projection, you can confirm, yes, we're not going to need a carryover waiver. We're in good shape. If you are significantly below that and it's not because of salaries or something, consider increasing how you monitor these expenditures, maybe more regular meetings with your finance officer, meeting and communicating with principals about spending at the school level, things like that. And of course, Project 310K is not the only Title I project that's open. We've got 3 different projects open. The most important deadline coming up would be for those FY 2021, or for in GMAP it's 22, sorry, Project I. We've got two deadlines there. The period of the award, we did get an extension on that, but it is ending on June 30th, so just 3 days from now. So that means that all of those I funds should be spent or encumbered by June 30th. And then you have until August 30th to submit your final federal cash request. And then, as I mentioned, for September 30th, 2024, we've got the deadline to have at least 85% encumbered for this year's funds. We've also got the deadline to have all funds spent or encumbered for last year's funds. So a lot of different dates coming up. If you didn't see our June Title I newsletter, there's a link to that on the slide that was sent to you. We had an announcement about Title I Next, some information on preparing for the GMAP application to open. Our Principal's Perspective article is very timely. It was about summer planning, specifically making sure that everything is in place to meet that Title I annual meeting requirement, which is another somewhat common finding that we see during monitoring. So share that with your Title I principals. And then we had our recurring articles about all of those deadlines for the open projects and our coordinators' year at a glance activities. All right, so today we're going to talk about the FY 2025 GMAP application, which should be opening soon. Remember that these allocations, when that does open, these are preliminary and subject to change. That can mean an increase or a decrease. So you want to make sure that you plan your program must-have items based on that hold harmless amount that you've kind of already been planning with. And for those of you who joined a little bit later, I did say at the very beginning, we do not have a date for when the GMAP application is opening. But when it does open, you will see that in the Commissioner's Monday message. I'll send out an email directly to all the coordinators letting them know. So you will definitely be made aware. Today's webinar is going to be a very high-level overview of the application and just some reminders to help you avoid the common issues that result in your application being returned as not approved. We know that's always frustrating, so we want to try to prevent that wherever we can. But for a more detailed look at each page of the GMAP application, you're going to want to refer to our GMAP training video series, which is linked on the slide, and you did get these slides earlier today. Those videos provide an in-depth look at each page of the application. There's a different page for each video, ranging from about 5 minutes to 20 minutes, I think, at the longest. Now, remember that these videos were recorded a few years ago, so there might be some very minor differences between the application that you see in the video and what you're going to see for FY25, but the content and the how-to information, that is all still the same. Also, don't forget that applications from previous years may also require your attention. So as we just saw on that table with all of the open projects, the Title I funds are available for 27 months. Over that 27-month period, plans are probably going to change, and that means that your application needs to be updated accordingly. So don't forget about that. Okay, so we're just going to look at kind of each page and do a quick rundown. The first page is the Introduction District Requirements page. So that page just has 7 questions, kind of a narrative style response, and they're all related to information that's required of all districts receiving Title I funds under Section 1112 of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Questions 1 through 4, those apply to all districts. Everybody must answer questions 1 through 4. Question 5 applies to all districts serving the kindergarten grade span with Title I Part A funds. And at least this past year, that applies to all the districts as well. So everybody needs to answer question 5 unless you are not serving any kindergarten. Questions 6 and 7 only apply if districts plan to use Title I funds for the purposes indicated in the question. There's one about digital learning, there's one about gifted and talented, a couple different things in there. If you are not using Title I funds to support those initiatives, you just put NA for those. So the most common reasons that we end up returning this page for revision would be writing NA for number 5, even though you serve some kindergartens, or providing responses for number 6 and 7, but then we look at the budget page and we don't see anything that's supporting those specific activities. We'll return it and we'll ask you to just put NA for 6 and 7. A tip for completing this page, be sure that you carefully read each question to ensure that your answer contains all of the required information. Also, avoid providing unrelated details, as they make the page more difficult and more time-consuming to review for the consultant. We're looking for a summary. A bulleted list is fine. It is not necessary to copy and paste entire sections of your CDIP or your needs assessment or any of those documents and put them in here. If your district is selected for monitoring, that's when the Title I consultant will go and take a deeper look at CDIPs and needs assessments and all of those things and look for that connection to the GMAP application. We don't need all of that information repeated here. The next page is the district set-aside page. So remember that funds reserved for district level services and activities belong on this page. Any school level services and activities, those are going to come from the school level allocations. We do have a couple of the set-aside categories that are required, and I just want to do a little overview of those quickly. First up is homeless. All districts must reserve a reasonable amount of funds to provide services to students experiencing homelessness at both Title I and non-Title I schools. So what you need to provide here, you need to reserve funds, and you also need to provide a narrative describing how the funds will be used and how you determine that that amount that you've reserved is reasonable. Remember, once the amount, the whole application receives KDE approval, that's us approving that amount. You can't go back and decrease it after that. Those funds have to be used for students experiencing homelessness, and the bulk of them should be used during the school year in which they were generated. So we shouldn't see large amounts of carryover for the homeless funds. So make sure you're being really intentional in considering how much you need to reserve there. Okay, the McKinney-Vento set-aside, this is required only for our districts who receive the McKinney-Vento grant. For those districts who do receive it, when they're completing that application, that includes agreeing to reserve a portion of Title I funds on top of the homeless reservation. And the amounts that are agreed to, they're going to be listed on the help page. We are getting ready to start a new cycle for the McKinney-Vento grant, so we don't have those numbers right now. Locally operated neglected institutions, this is required for districts serving those institutions. And again, on the help page, we've got a table listing all the applicable institutions, and that will be updated once all that information is available. Districts must reserve a reasonable amount of funds to serve those institutions. There are amounts listed on the chart in the help page. You don't have to reserve that exact amount. Our next required set-aside category is parent and family engagement. So this one's kind of got a couple of requirements. So for our districts receiving over $500,000 in their total Title I allocation, you must reserve 1% of that for parent and family engagement, at least 1%. Now, GMAP automatically calculates that 1% for everybody. You can go in and increase that amount. A lot of our districts opt to do that. Districts receiving less than $500,000, they can go in and reduce that amount. They can reduce it a little bit, they can reduce it to 0, that's up to them. But for those of you who are over $500,000, you cannot reduce it below that 1%. I also want to point out that at least 90% of that required 1% reservation is supposed to be distributed to the Title I schools for their parent and family engagement activities and resources they want to purchase and things. Now, all districts, whether you're required to reserve funds or not, must provide a narrative describing your parent and family engagement program. And you want to make sure this is describing your Title I parent and family engagement program. So not kind of your social events, your things that don't align with the intent of Title I Part A. Those are great and everybody enjoys those and absolutely keep doing them. But for the Title I, we want to see how it's tied to education and engaging parents in their child's education and things. For the English learners set aside, all districts must provide a narrative describing how the district is going to meet the parent notification and the parent outreach requirements for the parents of English learner students. Now, if the district doesn't have EL students currently, go ahead and describe how the requirements will be met in the event that EL students enroll at some point during the school year. For example, maybe you're going to kind of conduct a needs assessment with those parents once they enroll to see what they need and then kind of go from there. And information and more specifics on those requirements is available on the help page. For substitute salaries, again, all districts must provide a narrative, not necessarily reserve funds. This narrative just needs to state how substitutes for Title I funded staff taking sick or personal days will be funded. So oftentimes that's just a single sentence stating that the district uses general funds for all substitutes, or maybe the Title I schools are going to use their Title I allocation for substitutes in that scenario. The most common reasons that we return this page, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something on this slide. All of the other set-aside categories that I've not listed here, there's quite a few, those are all optional. You don't have to reserve funds. However, if you do need to provide a narrative along with that, giving us an idea of how the funds are going to be used. And we have a really helpful resource. It's our KDE guidance for districts on set-asides. Be sure that you check that out. Now, the most common reasons that we return this page for revision are missing information or narratives that don't include required information. For example, if your homeless narrative doesn't tell us how you determined that that was the amount to reserve, that your application is going to be returned. Another common reason is the McKinney-Vento grant recipient not reserving funds in the McKinney-Vento category, or the amount reserved does not match the amount on the table that's on the help page. You can't split that amount across the homeless and the McKinney-Vento set-asides. You have to have your homeless set-aside and that full McKinney-Vento set-aside amount. Another common reason would be your narrative indicating funds are being used for school level purchases. Remember, those need to be paid from the school allocations. They shouldn't be listed here. So the tip for completing this page, kind of similar to what I said on the previous page, narrative should provide a general idea of how requirements are going to be met and how funds will be spent. This doesn't have to be a gigantic narrative. Also, remember that this page communicates with the PPA page. So when you reserve funds at the district level on this page, those funds are now no longer able to be dispersed amongst your Title I schools on the PPA page. So let's say that your allocation is $450,000 and you reserve $25,000 on the district set-aside page. Now, when you go to the PPA page, the balance that you're going to see that can be distributed to your Title I schools is going to be $425,000. So they do talk to each other. The next page is the personnel details district-wide page. And this is where we list any district level staff who are being paid with Title I funds. So this is staff who work at the district, such as coordinators, or at multiple schools. You need to include the head count and the full-time equivalency, or FTE, for each staff member. And we always like to remind you that head count represents the number of people, so that's going to be a whole number, whereas FTE represents the portion of their salary that's being paid with Title I funds. That may not be a whole number. So for example, let's say we have one person who is paid 50% with Title I funds. They're going to have a head count of 1 and an FTE of 0.5. The staff who are listed on this page should also be referenced on the district set-aside page, and we should see an appropriate amount of funds for paying for those staff, and vice versa. So if you've got staff listed on the district set-aside page, they should be documented here as well. The common reasons for returning this page are the head count and or the FTE being incorrect. Specifically, head counts not being whole numbers, or maybe the FTEs are not listed in decimal format. For example, sometimes I've seen if a person is paid 100% from Title I funds, somebody puts 100, that just needs to be 1. So it's going to be a decimal format. Another reason is staff being listed on this page, but not on the district set-aside page, and vice versa. Staff not being referenced in any of the district set-aside narratives. If we don't see them in the narratives, we don't know that they need to be referenced on this page. Or maybe we see some staff referenced here, but when we look at the totals reserved on the district set-aside page, it doesn't look like it's sufficient to actually be paying for any staff. Another common reason is school level staff, such as classroom teachers, paraeducators, things like that, being included on this page. There's a separate page to document any school level staff who are being paid from Title I. The school program description page is up next. This is where you indicate how your district is going to determine the low income percentage for each school. And that's for the purpose of determining whether or not the school is eligible to receive Title I services, as well as ranking and serving schools. Selections made on this page are going to determine, like I said, which schools are eligible to receive funds and how the funds are going to be allocated. So the common reasons that we return this page, you have to select a date for when you pulled that poverty and low income information. It's supposed to be a date from the previous school year. So sometimes we get it and it's older than that, or it's from the current school year. It needs to be a day that schools were in session. So it can't be the middle of the summer or a weekend or holiday or something like that. And some more recent information that I've just received in the last few weeks, our data steward recommends using a date after October 1st, because that's the date that low income data is finalized and enrollment numbers should be more stabilized by then. Now that's not required, that's just a recommendation, but I did want to share that with you. Another reason is misalignment with the school eligibility page, and there's a couple ways that you can have misalignment. The first is the poverty factor. So for example, let's say that on this page, you've said we're going to use free and reduced price lunch numbers to determine our poverty. But then we go to the school eligibility page and you've selected direct certification from the drop-down. Those need to match. Another way they can be misaligned is the high school prioritization question. That's just a yes or no question. And it is asking you if you're going to prioritize your high schools, meaning you're going to serve your high schools who are between 50 and 75% before you serve your middle and elementary schools who are between 50 and 75%. Not a lot of districts do this. So this does not just mean, yes, I'm serving my high schools. It means I'm specifically prioritizing them. So sometimes we'll see yes has been selected for this, and then we look on the school eligibility page and you're just serving your high schools in regular rank and serve order. We can also see misalignment when school services and or eligibility on the school eligibility page don't align with the method of qualification for the attendance areas in schools. So let's say that you've selected district-wide poverty average. You're gonna, any school who is at or above your district-wide poverty average is gonna be eligible for services. But then we go to the school eligibility page and you want to serve schools who are below that percentage. We can also see misalignment between this page and the PPA page. So funds not being allocated to the schools as you've indicated on this page. So let's say that you've selected district-wide rank. You're just going to go straight down the poverty line in how you serve your schools. But then we get to the PPA page and you're actually doing grade span rank. So this page communicates with several other pages. Misalignment between this page and if you're just joining us, please make sure that you mute your mic. Thank you. The next page is the school eligibility page. On this page, you're going to see all of your schools in your district, A1 and non-A1 listed. So you need to go in and enter the enrollment, low income, and participating private school numbers for all of the A1 schools, whether they're going to be served or not, and any non-A1 schools that are being served with Title I funds. Service type and poverty factor must also be selected for all schools. So if they're going to be a school-wide program, or if they are school-wide program eligible, but they're not going to have a program, that kind of thing. And how the poverty was determined, direct certification, free and reduced price lunch, things like that. Now, for our non-A1 schools that are not receiving Title I services, you need to make sure that you've entered 0 for the enrollment and the low income numbers. And then you're going to select not a Title I school as the service and other as the poverty factor. So the most common reasons that we return this page for revision are, as I just mentioned on the previous slide, misalignment with the school program description page, and incorrect information for those non-A1 schools who are not being served. You've put their low income and enrollment numbers, or you've selected school-wide program eligible, free and reduced price lunch, things like that. Sometimes when we're monitoring, we run into an issue of the enrollment and low income numbers that are on the Infinite Campus report, the FRAM report, not matching this page in GMAP. So we strongly recommend that when you have those reports run from Infinite Campus, you go ahead and save those as part of your documentation process so that you can ensure that the numbers do match up. The next page is the per pupil amount page. It's called the PPA list page. So districts assign PPAs to all of their participating Title I schools, and that determines each school's Title I allocation. So if applicable, you want to make sure you're following rank and serve requirements, such as serving any schools who are at 75% low income or higher. Those need to be served first. And then we want to make sure that the PPAs for the schools below those 75% schools are following whatever selection you made on the school program description page, whether that's district-wide rank or grade span rank. Now, if any schools below 35% are being served, all schools must receive the minimum PPA or higher, and you'll see that up at the top of the page. It'll either say average PPA or minimum PPA, but if it says minimum, you have to use at least that amount. That doesn't apply to many of our districts. We also want to make sure that the remaining balance is as close to $0 as possible without being negative. So the most common reasons that we return this page are schools not being served in rank order and remaining balance. That's maybe a large positive remaining balance or a large negative remaining balance. Sometimes there will be a couple dollars or cents. You can either go and adjust the district set aside page if you want to zero that out. You can see if you can change any of the PPAs, but sometimes based on the number of students there are, you just can't get it to zero. So there's going to be a couple dollars and cents there, and that's okay. The next page is the school personnel and program description page. So this is where you're going to use the drop-down menu to add all of your schools that are going to be receiving Title I services. And then for any of those schools who are going to be paying for staff with Title I funds, you're going to provide that headcount and FTE information. And there's different categories: teachers, paraeducators, coaches, things like that. If you're not paying for any staff, you're just going to leave those blank. You'll add the school, and that's all you have to do. Now, for schools operating targeted assistance programs, there is a space at the very far right of the page where you need to provide a narrative on how students are going to be identified for services, but that's only for our targeted assistance programs. So when we return this page, it is usually for a Title I school not being included on the page. If we compare this to the school eligibility page, everybody who's listed as receiving services should be on this page. We also return it for those headcount and FTE issues, like I mentioned on the district personnel page. We'll also return it if you are operating school-wide programs and you've provided information in that narrative. We used to require that several years ago, but we don't anymore. So you want to make sure that if you're a school-wide program, you're just leaving that field blank. The next page is the services to private school page. GMAP is going to automatically calculate the equitable portion of funds based on the information that you enter on the school eligibility page, all of that low income and enrollment and private school number information. Now, if no private schools are participating, all you have to do is check the box on this page that says there's no participating private schools. Now, if there are participating private schools, you have to provide information for each one of those schools regarding how the number of low-income students was calculated, how you're going to select students for services, and then what type of Title I services are going to be provided. You also need to, if you're going to pay for any staff, provide the headcount and the FTE for them as well. You also want to make sure that a completed and signed equitable services consultation packet is uploaded into the district document library for each participating private school. So when we return this page, sometimes it's for issues with the data that's used to select students for services. Typically, when we return it, it's because you've maybe only listed one method. ESSA requires multiple educationally related methods for determining students for services. So, grades, different assessments, teacher observations, things like that. Or sometimes people list low income status as a method of selecting students for services. The methods have to be educationally related. The low income status is how we determine the students that generate the funds. Those aren't necessarily the students who are going to receive the services. The students who receive the services are the ones who are most at risk of failing to meet state standards. We also return this page if the description of services on the page doesn't align with the information in the consultation packet. We should see a lot of alignment between those. Sometimes we return it if the consultation packet has not been uploaded to the district document library, or you haven't uploaded the whole packet, or maybe the packet's not been signed. You want to make sure the whole thing is uploaded. It's signed by the district representative and the private school representative, and it aligns with the information that you've listed on this page. The next page is the budget page. So we do have 4 different budgets within the Title I Part A budget as a whole. And this year is going to be year L. So we've got 310L, that's our district and school activities. 310LN is going to be the non-public school activities. And then 310LP is non-public school parent and family engagement. So every budget entry that you make, every budget entry that you make requires a narrative, and that narrative is supposed to give the reviewer an idea of how the funds are going to be used. Now, in some cases, examples may be a bit helpful if it's kind of a more broad object code, and I'll go into that in just a minute. We want to make sure that the budget totals align with any other GMAP pages as applicable. You might want to consider breaking down the budget by location, more on that in a minute. And we definitely want to make sure that the remaining balance is 0. You want to make sure you allocate out all of those funds. So some of the object codes are pretty straightforward, such as anything related to salary and benefits and things. So a narrative like salaries for teachers, that would be a very sufficient narrative. Now, our more broad categories like general supplies, travel, bringing in any sort of like workshop or professional consultant, field trips, things like that, that's going to require more detail. Now, if parent and family engagement funds have been reserved on the district set-aside page, you want to make sure that the total amount that's in the budget matches with that page. Similarly, if you're serving private schools, we want to make sure that the 310LN and LP budgets align with the totals listed on the private schools page. When you're building your budget in GMAP, there is an option, a little drop-down button that allows you to assign each budgeted item to either the district or to a specific school. Now, you're not required to do this. We typically refer to it as breaking it down by location, but there are multiple benefits of doing so, so I just wanted to share those with you. It makes it very easy to verify that the district and each school receives the accurate amount of funds and that rank and serve requirements are being followed. You can actually filter the budget by location and then just compare the total budgeted to either the district set-aside page or the PPA page and all the totals there. It also helps as you are working to align GMAP and MUNIS, which we do recommend you're doing on at least a quarterly basis. And it makes it easier to make adjustments to the budget when reallocations are released. You can go in and zero in on what needs to be changed much easier. So it is a little bit more work on the front end, but a lot of districts who, especially when we've done monitoring and we've kind of walked them through this, they've found that it is worth the extra effort in the long run. Now, the most common reasons that we return this page are totals not aligning with other GMAP pages. So this could refer to the total budget for something like parent and family engagement or private schools, or it could refer to an individual school's allocation not aligning with their allocation on the PPA page. It could also refer to something like the amount reserved for homeless not lining up. We also return it if the remaining balance is not 0. And a big reason that we return it is budget narratives lacking sufficient detail. So for example, let's say that you've used the object code for general supplies and your narrative says general supplies needed for program implementation. that doesn't provide your KDE consultant with an idea of how your funds are going to be spent. So providing a little more detail is going to help ensure that you spend your funds on allowable things. Now, we're not talking about an exhaustive list of everything that you're going to buy. Just, a little bit of detail, maybe a few examples, that would be sufficient. We also return it when the budget narratives reference unallowable expenditures. For example, let's say you're using the food object code and you've written meals for parent and family engagement event. We know that we can only purchase light snacks and refreshment. We can't purchase meals. Or maybe field trips and you've listed like the amusement park or something that's not an educational field trip, or awards and you've listed things other than ribbons and certificates. You've listed trophies and plaques and things like that, or student planners, take-home folders, a lot of different things that we've gone over being unallowable. There is one page after the budget page that you have to complete. That's the Consolidated State Performance Report Details page, or CSPR. So the information on this page is used for KDE to meet some of the federal reporting requirements that we have to meet. So it has two different sections, one for neglected institutions and one for private schools served during the previous school year. If you didn't serve neglected and or private schools, there's just a little box that you check to say we didn't serve these. If you did, you're going to list each neglected institution and or private school in the applicable section. And then you're going to list the number of students broken down by either their age or their grade range that received services during the 23-24 school year. Some reasons that we returned this page: if you haven't checked those boxes saying that you didn't serve any of those facilities. And if we look at last year's application and we see you did serve neglected institutions or private schools, but you haven't provided any information on this page, we're going to return it for that. So just some final thoughts about completing your GMAP application. Be sure that you are carefully reviewing the requirements for each page, providing sufficient detail. We want to make sure that you're providing enough detail for KDE consultants to have a general idea of how requirements will be met, what's going to be purchased, etc. And as I mentioned very early on, please try to avoid including unrelated information or really lengthy paragraphs that can make it very hard to review your application for you. And of course, make sure that you reach out to your consultant with any questions. Consultants are meeting after this to kind of talk about GMAP and reminders for how to review applications. All right, so consultants are going to be talking about reminders and things for looking at GMAP applications. Another thing I just wanted to say very briefly is remember that sometimes something comes on a previous year's application that gets overlooked that shouldn't have been. We're all human. So if your consultant has a question about something that was approved on your previous application, or maybe we get new guidance determining that something is or isn't allowable, you might get some feedback about that, but please just kind of understand that we're doing our best. Okay, so that wraps up the webinar today. So I'm going to check for any questions. All right. Oh, I'm just saying everything about being frozen. Okay, let me check the email. Okay, I don't see anything on email. All right, upcoming webinar dates, make sure to mark your calendar. The next webinar is July 25th at 10 a.m. We also have the monthly webinar feedback survey. Appreciate people filling that out. So we did get some feedback last month, some positive feedback, and a topic suggestion about kind of some more details on examples from schools and districts who are doing things right after monitoring. So I'm going to work on trying to figure out how to tie in some more examples to future webinars. All right, and I'll do a last check for questions. I don't see any, so sorry about all the technical difficulties today, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you in July.